My name is Bill Chirpaugh. I was born on October the 8th, 1932. I'm third generation in the village of Victoria Road. I grew up in Victoria Road and I worked away a lot. I moved back permanently in 1964 with my wife and family. I had bought a farm here and I started raising cattle as well as working out. I worked at Uniroyal in Lindsay for 4 or 5 years, and then I got a job on the assessment department in Lindsay. It became the assessment department for the province in about 1970, I believe, and I stayed there until I retired. I retired mainly due to my wife's health. My family emigrated here from Uxbridge, and my grandfather was not married at that time. This was about in the mid-1800s. He worked in a hotel in Coboconk, which later burned, and around 1860 or 70 he moved to Victoria Road and either bought or built a hotel and bought a lumber mill and shingle mill, and was in business at both these places until he died in the 1920s. He had 2 children, my father and my aunt. My father was Grant Chirpaugh, and he was here all his life, and my aunt married a returned veteran from the First World War. He was originally from Weyburn, Saskatchewan, and he lived in the Toronto area and various places around throughout his life, and had a family of 5 children. Growing up in Victoria Road, we had, at that time, we had 2 garages, 2 stores, a hotel with a pool room, an ice cream bar. There was an undertaker who also owned a building that he run his business out of. He had the library and an ice cream parlor, all part of this business, this undertaking business. Our main enjoyment, I guess, was going uptown on a Saturday night or through the week and meeting our friends at one of the stores and carrying on as most kids do, getting into trouble sometimes. In the summer we spent a lot of time at the dam where we could swim off the dam, jump off the dam and swim. We went back to school in the fall as a bunch of skeletons from being down there swimming and playing all the time. Had snowball fights in the winter, and we used to snowball the people going to shop at Meyers store because there was a big coat sign behind where they had to walk by, and it usually scared them when we hit this sign. One of our stores in town was Neil's store. It was a general store, and it's written in a book as the largest general store in Canada. It had business on 4 or 5 floors, 4 floors I believe. The basement was where they filled their truck up with groceries for daily delivery to different areas around. It also had an egg grading station, and that's where they butchered their meat that they bought locally. The next floor up was a bake shop, and it was very popular with the Toronto tourists that come out to their cottage. They loved to come up and get Rod Crary's baking, both bread and buns and so on. The next floor was the main floor where the groceries were, and canned goods, etc. The next floor up was their office and their dry goods. And then the next floor up was their living, where they lived. And they didn't have flip phones or anything like that at that time, or iPhones, so they had a tube that come down from the living area down into the store. And when they needed help, they went over and they talked into the tube and asked for somebody to come down and help them. The favorite place for some of the old people on a Saturday night when the hockey game was on was to sit on the steps from the main floor up to the dry goods floor where the office was, and they could listen to the hockey game there. One experience I remember was I was with my mother shopping one time in there. I guess I was about 5 years old, and this old gentleman who was a farmer and wasn't always dressed up to slick. He was kind of grubby sometimes. He always had a pocket full of Globe chocolates, and as soon as he seed me, he'd call me over and give me a handful of these Globe chocolates. And my mother wasn't too happy with that because he wasn't the cleanest old gentleman in the world. Okay, Mr. Meyers moved from Gillert here about 1938, I think, around that time. He was a storekeeper in Gillert. He bought the store on the 4 corners of Victoria Road. It was quite a big store. He had a good line of groceries. He had some dry goods. He had some hardware and normal tools for the farmers around, shovels, forks, etc. It was quite a meeting place on a Saturday night because he had a back room with a stove in it. The wives would chop out in front, and the men would sit back around the stove and tell stories about their farming and their experiences. And of course, we'd sit there as children or younger people to hear all these stories. Then as we got a little older, we'd get into trouble sometimes on a Saturday night. During the war years, there were no candies, so the treat would be maybe a can of tomato juice or some bologna. So we'd go down to Neil's store and we'd get a can of tomato juice, and drink it. And then when we got through, we'd clamp it onto our foot, and we'd come up to Meyers store and walk around with this noisy tin can on our feet. So we usually got asked to leave. There was usually a window broke in the front of the store facing the main street, because they'd sit out there in the winter sometimes talking, and of course we'd be across the street throwing snowballs at them, and once in a while a window got broke. Another trick we had was farmer would come into town with his older car and park and do his shopping, and then when he'd go to leave, we'd hold it. And of course in the slick roads in the winters in those days, he wouldn't be able to go until he got out and chased us. And then by the time he got back in his car, we'd be holding on to it again. But we didn't, this was the most trouble we ever got into. There was nothing vicious or nasty or anything. Another store in Victoria Road, which was really not in operation very much during my lifetime, but towards the end of the war, he was going out of business. The store was owned by Alf Everson, and tea was hard to get in at that time due to the war, and sugar, stuff like that. So Alf always had some tea and some sugar there. So my dad would go in to get some couple of pounds of sugar or some tea, but you also had to buy pumpkin pie filling and stuff like that wasn't selling. So if you wanted the tea, you'd buy a couple of cans of pumpkin pie filling as well, and that was the way Alf got rid of all his stock before he sold out. Okay, the undertaker's name in my day, it was Charlie Davy, and he owned the undertaking parlors, where he done his undertaking business upstairs. On the floor down below, facing onto the street, was a library and an ice cream parlor. So it all seemed to be all right. The only thing is, when he was undertaking, sometimes we could get up on the garage roof right across the alley and look in and watch him. And the last person I remember him an undertaker under this old yellow light was Bill Neal, who had quite a growth on his head, and I see that shining in the dark. I still see it. So after a week or so after doing that, I'd have to walk out around the street and go out in the middle of the street to go home, because I didn't like walking in front of that little store. Victoria Road Station was erected in 1872 when the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railroad went through. It serviced the industries in Coboconk, which was milling, quarrying, to name two of them. There was probably more. And then coming this way, at Raven Lake, there was the cement works, and it was quite a big operation for about 4 years. It opened in 1904, and due to a free trade agreement, closed in 1908, because they could ship the cement in cheaper than dig it out of Raven Lake. It serviced the mills in Victoria Road, the population of Victoria Road, the logging which affected the village of Victoria Road, and there was a peat bog operation north of Victoria Road, which they took the peat out, I think, for fuel. And then on the way to Kirkfield, there was the Kirkfield Stone Crusher. So the train serviced all of these industries, plus quite a big industry between logging, milling, cedar posts, etc., going out from the bush. And at one time, apparently there was 2 trains a day that went through to Coboconk and back. In my time, there was a train 3 times a week which came in, and of course it was passengers. Well, you could catch it and go right through to Toronto. Some of the food used to come in by train, ice cream and so on. Our church in the village was the United Church, which was up on the main street of Victoria Road on Richmond Street, and there was a Catholic church north of Victoria Road. I went to the United Church. It had been a Presbyterian church originally, and I went to Sunday school at the church when I was old enough to go to the Sunday school. Before that, I was pretty well kind of dragged to church by my grandmother and my mother, and I don't have too many recollections of it other than being fairly bored. But in the fall, there used to be a lot of hornets that were flying around inside the church, and some old ladies would be sitting there, old gentlemen half asleep, would usually get stung by the hornet, and that was a little excitement. And we had a minister by the name of Mr. Stewart when I was a teenager, and he had young peoples for us once a week. He was a lay minister, but he was a very nice gentleman and part of the community. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, the church closed due to a lack of attendance. I went to the Victoria Road Public School, which is a 2-room school. The junior room was grade 1 to grade 4. The senior room was grade 5 to grade 8. During the war years, 1941, I was in grade 4, and the young teacher that was teaching in the junior room quit and went into the army about Easter time. So they didn't have a teacher to fill in. My mother had been a teacher, so they hired her to fill in the rest of the year, and she was there for approximately 18 years, I believe, and she ended up teaching. It became a 1-room school with grade 1 to grade 8, and then she ended up teaching grade 9 and 10. There was only a couple of students, but she was able to teach them grade 9 and 10, and then the bus started, I believe, in 1945. I was in grade 4, and I graduated into grade 5. I don't know whether I should have or not, but my mother got me out of grade 4 anyway, so she didn't have to be bothered with me. I started the high school in 1945 on a school bus, which Deneur from Lindsay started the first school bus run for us up in this area. We'd get on the bus about 7 o'clock in the morning, and we'd go from Victoria Road to Kirkfield and then down what was called the 10th concession into Cambry. We'd go into Glenarm on the way, pick up students in Glenarm, then come out and go on down the 10th concession into Cambry, and then on to Lindsay. A lot of stories about riding the bus, winter storms. In the winter, we ended up spending one winter, I think it was about 1947 or 48. We had some bad storms, and we got stuck halfway between Cambry. But we walked into this farmhouse, pretty well the whole busload, and they were an elderly couple who couldn't really look after us. So between the bus driver and the old gentleman that owned the farm, they hitched up a team of horses to sleighs to take us on into Cambry. And due to the weather conditions, I guess there was the sleigh grounded on sand going out the lane and broke the harness. So we ended up walking anyway. And we walked to the first farm just west of Cambry. There were Tamblins, and we were there for 3 days till this storm they got squared around. We were there and we missed a lot of our Easter exams, which we were quite happy about. And it didn't bother us at all. It was part of fun of going to high school, I guess. We got stuck in Lindsay in another snowstorm. We stayed at the Grand Hotel. And I know sometimes we'd get out, the bus driver would be stuck. He'd ask us to push. If we were going to school, we'd hold the bus, and if we were going home, we'd push it. And that was just some of the fun of going to high school in those days in 1945 to 50. I quit in 1950, so I had to get on to different adventures after that. In 1964, I moved into my farm here, which I'd previously bought, and I started raising cattle, and it's more of a ranching area in this area than farming. You have a few acres that you can raise cattle on and feed them in the summer, and grow hay for them in the winter, and that is pretty well it, unless you bought a stock truck and you're renting property around and running the roads all the time. I just farmed my approximately 300 acres here, and I had 30 acres of land that I could grow hay on, so I could pasture about 20 cows and grow hay to feed about 20. So that was the extent of my farming. First few years I was farming, it was still the square bales, and that was a lot of work. I was lucky to have my family help me. And then it went to round bales, and I contracted that out to Jim Everson for a while, and then Dave Burton. It eased the workload of the haying procedure by quite a bit. There were some big ranches around here. The Cameron Ranch was 3,000 acres to the north of us. My dad ended up owning 1,200 acres here at one time. And most of them were grassland, rough grassland. Of course, in those days, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, you could get by with a small farm. Now, these small farms are being leased out to bigger operators, including mine. Victoria Road has gone from at one time a village of approximately 10 stores, 3 hotels, 2 or 3 mills, 2 or 3 blacksmith shops, undertakers, a doctor or 2, drugstore, library, etc. In my time that I was around here growing up as a teenager, we had 2 garages, 2 stores, a hotel with a pool room. There's nothing left but newer people moving in. The older people have pretty well gone, one way or another. I don't know what is going to become of the village. It's nice to see the younger people moving in. Most of them have jobs and so on. They're working away. There's a few retirement people moving in that can afford the homes and so on, I guess. So that's about all I can tell you about Victoria Road now.